My name is Ann Mosley. I'm the Director of Engagement and Curator of the Sangamon Experience and Acting Director for the Center for Lincoln Studies here at UIS. This year, the symposium is holding a theme called Changing Historical Landscapes. The lineup features historians, artists, and community members engaged in efforts to reimagine, reinvigorate, and revise commemoration and historic interpretation throughout the state of Illinois. Our panel that we have today is considering monuments, and our moderator is Dr. Dave Jones, who's the state archivist for the state of Illinois. He is the 5th generation resident of Illinois and lives in Springfield. Jones received a bachelor's degree in political science and history from Northern Illinois University, a master's degree in both political science and history from the University of Illinois at Springfield, and a doctorate in Illinois history from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. He is the author of several articles on Illinois history and of the book From Slave to State Legislator, which is a biography of John W.E. Thomas, Illinois' first African-American state legislature. Now, before we move on to Dr. Jones here, we would like to invite you to become a member of the Illinois State Historical Society if you are not. If you are, I want you to consider gifting a membership to the next generation of Illinois historians and those who may have an interest. Also, if you have the opportunity to donate, feel free to go to the Illinois State Historical Society's website and submit a donation. That helps create symposiums like this and future programming for the Illinois State Historical Society. Now, if you are attending the symposium for the first time today, I encourage you to go to the YouTube page for the Illinois State Historical Society, which will be listed within the chat, and take a look at some of our previous programs that we have had, and also see the videos that have been posted before the symposium started this year. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Dave Jones, who will introduce our panelists for this session.
Thank you, Annie. And just very quickly, when you say I received a degree from SIU Carbondale, I want to assure Walt Williams, who's from Edwardsville, that I did take at least 2 classes at the SIU Edwardsville campus. So no stranger to your neck of the woods, Walt. My name is Dave Jones. Again, I'm director of the Illinois State Archives, and I hope most of you have seen this panel discussion. We actually recorded it on April 12th, and it's appeared on the ISHS YouTube, I think starting around the 14th. If you haven't seen it, by all means, take a look at it. It is a little unusual to record a session and then a week or 2 later have a live session with questions. But that's what we're going to do. That's the Zoom world and the pandemic world we live in. And I'm looking forward to, a continuation of the discussion, because I thought we had a very good discussion 2 weeks ago. And it was a good discussion because it was statewide. I'm going to introduce the panelists, one of whom is not here, but was part of the discussion 2 weeks ago and is, of course, on the recording. So the first panelist was Andrea Agert. Andrea was selected as the 3rd architect of the Capitol of Illinois in 2019 after working for several years as a project architect for Shive Hattery, an Iowa-based architecture and engineering firm with an office in Bloomington. The Office of the Architect of the Capitol is responsible for developing and implementing a long-range master plan of development for the Capitol complex. And that includes the statues and the artwork at the Capitol complex. She's a native of Newton, Illinois, and received her undergraduate degree in architecture from SIU, Carbondale, sorry, Walt, and a master's degree in architecture from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Sorry, Annie. We also are joined by Sherry Williams, who was raised in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago and moved to Bronzeville as an adult. Brownsville, of course, also a neighborhood in Chicago. She's a community activist and environmentalist. Sherry, happy belated Earth Day. And she's the founder and president of the Brownsville Historical Society in Chicago South Side. Ms. Williams has an undergraduate degree in African American and Black Studies from Northeastern Illinois University and a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Illinois. And we're also joined by Walter Williams. Mr. Williams lives in Edwardsville, Illinois, and serves as that city's Economic and Community Development Director. He has held similar positions in Commerce City, Colorado, and Farmington, Missouri. Mr. Williams has been involved in the Edwardsville chapter of the NAACP for the past several years, and last November was elected to that organization's as that organization's new president. Walt holds a bachelor's degree in economics and African American Studies from Denison University and a Master of Business Administration from, as I saw it online, the John Carroll University, not just John Carroll University. As I said when we did our session on April 12th, I'm thrilled that this is not a panel of just historians. I think what that shows is that history is, affects us all even today. And the purpose of this panel, which was titled Reevaluating Historical Monuments in Illinois, the purpose of the panel is to have these discussions. We've hit a moment, we should always be evaluating our history and how we commemorate it, but we've hit a moment in time where we seem to be doing it a lot more. And I think as a historian and having a panel largely of non-historians, I think that's a good thing. I think that's where we want to be. When we met in April, Andrea began and she discussed, we discussed basically three issues. Sherry talked about reevaluating monuments up in Chicago. Andrea did at the Capitol Complex, and Walt did about an issue in Edwardsville. So I think we're going to recap that. And actually, I'll start with you, Walt, in Edwardsville, just to kind of give us a brief recap. Again, it was on the symposium, but a brief recap of a monument controversy that's going on in Edwardsville, which for people who don't know is the county seat of Madison County, which is in Metro East by St. Louis. So Walt, if you can give us kind of a quick recap.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to present this information. As you know, a lot of communities around the country started looking at themselves a little bit more critically, the monuments, the statues, in light of the George Floyd incident last year. Edwardsville was nothing different. In that regards, we looked at ourselves, and several community members got together and said, no longer will this be allowed to exist. They got together, they protested, they presented themselves at our city council and voiced their opinion about that this monument represented racism. So going forward, I'm not going to recap everything I said in my initial recording. However, I will add that since April 12th, the city council is actually looking at taking down the statue as it exists today. So thank you.
All right, and again, we found that interesting just because the town of Edwardsville named after Ninian Edwards, and yet given his past especially, they're talking about taking down a statue. That was an interesting part of the movement. Equally interesting is up in Chicago where Sherry's at, and again, not to recap what we all talked about last time, but is there anything new there, or can you give kind of a summation of what's going on with monuments and statues up in the Chicagoland?
So certainly many may have already heard about the efforts of Mayor Lightfoot to address what has been considered monuments and markers and statues that have a history that is one that's connected to either slavery, racism, war. I mean, we could go on in the litany of titles that these 40 plus monuments have been identified as having a connection to. What I bring to this gathering today is my experience in working in a state site. And so Bronzeville Historical Society from 2012 to 2017 had an office on the grounds of Senator Stephen A. Douglas' tomb site. And what was unique about our presence there was the fact that programming that was shaped on the grounds itself in and around the tomb site was shaped by the community's voice. And the one thing that they found so important was to speak deeply about some of those painful histories that we're now exploring across the globe. And so since 2012, we've had the honor of being able to have libation ceremonies in which we would read all 129 names of those known to be enslaved by Senator Douglas at his plantations in Mississippi. And so once we moved from that site in 2017, we became very alarmed by the fact that there were no programs that continued that was a reflection of the surrounding community's voice. And so I just wanted to give folks sort of a marker about my position there at the site. And that is that I believe the site should remain because it is a grave site. Of course, that is purely because of the fact that there's a part of me that believes no one's grave should be desecrated. And but certainly I believe that it affords us an opportunity to use that space, to use the Senator Douglas tomb site in a way that we could have restorative justice. And so I've appealed to all of the legislators in writing and by phone calls to just see how we could even explore revisiting the narratives that are on the grounds to speak more clearly about the moral compass of Senator Douglas and his role in the Kansas-Nebraska Act and other things that he legislated or led charge on. And hopefully this could be a way to better use sites that certainly have these narratives that are quite painful.
Well, I love that the way you ended that, Sherry, with how we better use sites. Andrea is not here, so I'm going to probably embarrass the heck out of myself and speak for her, but discuss briefly what the situation was at the state capitol, which last year as the reevaluating of monuments movement spread, Stephen Douglas's name came up at the Illinois state capitol. And eventually a statue of him and Stephen Douglas, although technically didn't own slaves, profited from it. You certainly can't argue with what a virulent racist he was. But a statue of his was removed on the Capitol grounds. A statue of Pierre Menard, who was the first lieutenant governor of the state of Illinois, was removed. That statue had issues beyond Pierre Menard himself. It showed a Native American kind of in a subservient position. I mean, that was a statue that people had questioned for years, quite honestly. A portrait of Stephen Douglas in the House chamber has been covered up and eventually will probably be removed. There's still a statue of Stephen Douglas inside the Capitol, and a statue of Martin Luther King Jr., which was across from the Capitol grounds, I believe is slated to be moved to the Capitol grounds. And this was done, again, in response to protests in Springfield and the greater issue as a whole. One question, though, that arises is these statues have been removed. And as historians, when we look at things like this, one of the things we look at is, okay, who hasn't been represented? Is it just about removing statues? And if it is, and if it isn't, what do we do beyond that? How do we include other people? And Sherry, I think you've had a lot of experience with that. So up in Chicago, looking at some of the nuances of some of the issues up there, but also about bringing other people into the historical narrative. Can you maybe talk just a little bit about that?
Well, way ahead of what conversations that are happening nationally and globally about monuments and statues, communities have been asking all along for many years, including the society's members, and that is, who exactly is shaping what goes into the public spaces. And so I'm thinking in terms of public spaces would be the parks, whether they're city managed or they're part of the state of Illinois assets or even part of the national assets. And so often there's this bureaucracy that it's very difficult to find out exactly who has been the decision makers in the past and those decision makers who are even now currently in place. It's very hard to find out who exactly is in charge of the care and management of these spaces, let alone follow the procedural ways or policies or criteria for creating monuments that reflect communities that are surrounding either places that monuments and statues that have been in place 50, 70, 100 years. In the sense of Douglas Tomb site, of course, he's been buried at that location since 1861. The community has never said to me personally that they found it offensive for the site to be a representation of his life in terms of what is on the kiosk there and what's part of the monument itself. What has been the issue for the community has been access to use it and have their voice there. And so I think when I look at the conversations that are happening now, there are no clear paths for how do you even assert that you would like a replacement or something that at least looks at the revisionist histories and have maybe a more meaningful context or text in these places that we now have in communities.
Well, that brings up a good point in terms of Edwardsville, because the statue, as I understand it down there, I mean, it was a groundswell of petitions were filed with the city about the statue, and that's a fairly good number. But Edwardsville, and we talked a little bit about this in the recording, Edwardsville is a small town, about 25,000 people, and these issues can be pretty divisive. And then you throw in a university as well, chock full of historians like me, and you never know where you're going to go. But I think Edwardsville, I know it's renamed Edwards Park. I think the city has responded, maybe not to everybody's satisfaction, but it certainly has responded to the petitions in one manner or another. But are they looking at all at either removing the statue or, again, doing more interpretation with history or even adding more monuments? I thought I saw something about Edward Coles at one point, the second governor of Illinois.
Well, there is already a monument for Edward Coles. There is also a house for Benjamin Stevens, whose backgrounds were not the greatest as well. As you have mentioned, the city has renamed Meeting in Edwards Park to City Park, City Plaza. So that has already changed. But right now, at the last meeting of the committee, it was decided that they should move it, and that will just be a vote of council within the next couple of weeks.
Oh, wow. So where are they going to move it to?
Right now, I do not know the details of that right now. So that's the thinking behind it. But the interpretive plaque received a no-go from the opponents of the statue because, again, the way it is positioned on a pedestal. He was a short person. However, the pedestal made him more of a prominent person by default. So there were really no way to get an agreement because the community was equally divided on both lines. So I agree with the community. They should be removed and maybe placed in a museum or someplace where it could be observed and interpreted better.
Well, the news from here in Springfield, a couple of things that I meant to mention since we met. First of all, Springfield itself, I'll speak for the city, we had a Stephen Douglas Park that's been renamed Otis Duncan Park. Otis Duncan was a African-American war hero in World War I, and if you ever look at his life story, it's a really interesting life story. And I know Chicago Douglas Park, named after Stephen Douglas, was renamed Frederick Douglass Park. And they added an S. The other thing that's new is the Speaker of the House, Chris Welch, the new Speaker, has formed a task force to review monuments and artwork on the Capitol complex with an eye towards incorporating everybody's history into that. One of the things about the state capitol is most of the statues and artwork there is from the 1880s. Well, the state was 50, 60 years old at that point. We've had a whole lot of history now. Again, on that level alone, it seems like it's a good time to be reviewing, artwork. Just the fact that we've omitted 160 years worth of Illinois history, give or take. So that's a new thing that's happened in Springfield, and they're going to hold public hearings. I don't know how much it's modeled after. It's a legislative task force. So I was going to say, I don't know how much it's modeled after the Chicago Monuments Commission that Sherry's knows of in Chicago, but that's not a legislative task force in Chicago, but this one is. But they will hold public hearings, and I think they're going to hold them statewide. and try to talk a little bit about some of the nuances with history. Sherry, have you had any interaction with the Chicago Monuments Commission?
I have. I've been reading correspondence that's been coming from the commission, and I know that they are plugging away with gathering ideas and suggestions from community members. And actually, they opened up an opportunity window for over 6 weeks, and it might still be open for those who'd like to make recommendations or suggestions or alternative courses for removing those 40, I believe it's now 41 statutes and monuments in Chicago that have been considered to have a narrative that is one that is an issue with many.
Okay, Annie, do we have any questions? I don't want to totally revisit the recording. I do want everybody to watch it. It is, I don't know if it's gone viral yet, but I expect it to. But Annie, do we have any questions for our panelists?
Don't see any at the moment. Folks, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. I've been noticing some of the chatter within the chat box and with others on social media. And one of the big questions I think we had was with Lincoln and Douglas, their stories throughout Illinois are intertwined quite a bit. And so it becomes quite difficult to find a way to separate the two of them because we wouldn't have Lincoln without Douglas, which is kind of a big saying among Lincoln scholars. So what advice do you have to those in the Lincoln field who are kind of struggling with trying to find a way to showcase Lincoln and Douglas within the state? Because I know currently in Springfield, there are a lot of conversations on the Lincoln statues. And that's something that I found interesting as a part of this panel, is discussing, you know, the reasons behind Lincoln, and we know the ones behind Douglas. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I don't know. I'll let Sherry go on that because, again, Brownsville, which is in the shadow of property that, and some of Brownsville probably is, of course, property that Douglas owned, and of course, the shadow of his tomb in the Douglas Monument. Now, how do you tell that story? Or are you covering up history? And we can expand that question. Are you covering up history? We'll start with Sherry, but then go to Walt with Ninian Edwards. Are you covering up history by, you know, getting rid of these statues? Sherry?
I truly believe we would be. And despite the painful histories around these whom had been celebrated with having a marker or monument, I think truthfully, the one issue that many of us have had has not been the monument just itself or the marker just itself. It's the unreliable, whitewashed histories that are written to say this validates this person being celebrated. So, you know, if you go to the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site, you know, it glosses over his work as a legislator, his humble beginnings coming here from Vermont, but it does not ever talk, you know, more deeply about some of the things that he has said that is on record. And so communities know that he was a racist. Communities know that he enslaved African Americans, well, men and women of African descent. Records show his cruelty was such with his enslaved, those that were enslaved by him. Now, anytime another slaveholder tells you that you're a horrible slaveholder, then you're a bad slaveholder. So, I mean, there's things that are out there that don't have to be dug up or found. They're readily available within the context of his records themselves, which are at the University of Illinois, at the University of Chicago. And also, there are plenty of annotations that reference materials that show the voice of Stephen A. Douglas. So I think that's been the one thing that is a problem for a lot of these sites, is that a lot of folks may not have ever known the histories of these individuals who were celebrated. And I caution the idea of removals, not because I don't see the passion or the compassionate ways in which people are really looking at this. But if I look at just the intersection of 35th and Cottage Grove, where the Douglas tomb sits just 400 or 500 feet away from that corner, we have a park across the street that's called Ellis Park. And his role in military service, being one of the warmongers among many who we have parks named after, I mean, when does it end? So that's been a question for us, because we'll be renaming stuff or removing things for probably another 30 years. If we really looked critically and honestly at street names, Washington, Harrison Street, you name all of the streets pretty much for the first 12, 13 presidents, you're guaranteed that they would have been slaveholders at some point of their lives, those first presidents. So my point being that, where do we stop examining it and not just maybe looking at where those clear ways in which we can talk about these individuals critically and not to be offensive is part of the historical record.
And while this is a tough question for you, but the Edwards statue, Edwardsville is named after an Indian Edwards, and yet the town didn't have a statue to Indian Edwards. And then in 2008, I believe, not paid for by the city, I think it was private donations, is when they installed the statue. And 13 years later, when the people who paid for the statue and installed it are still around, and I would assume making the case that this is Edwardsville, we want a statue of Edwards. Again, kind of the same question. What is the role of history there?
Okay, I did a lot of remarks that my colleague just made. In addition, I will add to the fact that when the statue was erected, there were no guidelines by the city established on the nature or the type of individual that you would put a statue of. Ironically, I wrote those guidelines in 2017, 2018. And again, I came on board in 2015. But the fact that our community is aware, has been made aware because of all the incidents that happened in 2020. But let me give you a side story. We also have something called Governor's Plaza, where we recognize, the city of Edwardsville recognizes the former governors from Edwardsville. And in the process, we had high school students write the narratives for these plaques. And we got together, we reviewed what they were writing, and the discussion was, these are not good people. Why are we having a plaza of governors and the backgrounds are questionable? So to talk about what my colleagues just said before me, it is heightening their awareness. They are aware of it, and it's part of our discussion now. I agree, we'll be removing monuments and statues for the next 30 years. What does that get us? Where does that take us? Are we missing a part of history? And again, that was the counter argument, but the mood right now, as of last year, 2020, 2021, it is, let's remove this. As I indicated in my recorded remarks, Indian Edwards statue was by default because we already recognized the two other people here in our community. So there was no real reasoning. There was no real groundswell of support. It was privately funded. So this is what you get. However, moving forward, I believe the community will be more critical of how we name things and how we raise people of prominence going forward. So maybe that's a good thing. But right now, it is an extremely divisive issue within our community. Thank you.
And it's divisive in other places. And I think having the discussion is a good thing, if only because as part of the discussion, they'll have to go to historians, and employment for me as a historian. I'm thrilled by that. But you both make a great point, and it's also a point that can be made with the state capitol, I think, as well, which is if it furthers the discussion. I know I've never quite been comfortable with, hey, let's put up a plaque, you know, and that becomes the discussion. I don't know how much that furthers it, but one of the reasons for this panel is Walt and Sherry, neither of you, this isn't a new issue. Walt, you talked about in 2017, 2018, you were already drafting local ordinances or legislation. And Sherry, I know you've been on this issue a lot. And that's what I think this takes is some discussion. And I think we may go through 30 years of removing monuments, but you know, you bring up, Sherry, a great point about streets and certainly parks as well. But if there's a reasonable discussion, or if there's a way to use these monuments or whatever to promote a discussion of history, of course, I'm all for that. I think I think that would be awfully good. Annie, do we have any other questions?
Yes, we have two questions, and Walt and Sherry, thank you so much for answering that, because I know that you're probably in talks with historians about these issues, and there is a lot of history that's not being told that is difficult to teach. And I know that we probably have some teachers that are watching this panel trying to get some advice on how to discuss this. So I'm going to turn over to our next two questions, but I just wanted to make sure to thank you for that, because it's very interesting to hear and gives us some advice moving forward. So Tim Motz, I'm sorry if I get your last name wrong. Motaz, thank you, asked, unless I'm misunderstanding it, wasn't there an outcry in Chicago media and on Capitol Facts about a month ago about Chicago Monuments Commission meeting minutes either not released or closed to the media? What was the background on that? What is the, where can we find out more information on the decision making behind the decisions of the statues to be removed? And then he goes on to ask, in the panel discussion video, he wants to find out more about the commission itself and the members that reside near the parks and sites with monuments and statues targeted at removal.
I know Devin has posted a link to the Chicago Monuments project online, so in the chat area, so he can find that. And then Sherry, if you can, and if you can't, you're not, I know you're not with the Chicago Monuments, but do you have anything to add about how they're doing in terms of meeting with the public?
I could step back a little bit from its humble beginnings. I know that when I heard that the commission was being shaped by Mayor Lightfoot, I immediately reached out to the mayor's office to find out what was the criteria, how was the selection process being managed, and who actually was going to select those who would be a part of the Monuments Commission for the city of Chicago. And what I found out was that nobody could tell me who picked the folks. There was a considerable effort on the part of the Chicago Cultural Alliance and its 72 member institutions and organizations to request that I become a part of that commission, to no avail. If you were to go to their website, you will see who is the members of that commission. And, you know, quite frankly, I know a number of those who are on the commission in terms of their artistic presence on the south side of Chicago. But overall, I would say that the commission is not comprised of those who have been for 40, 50, 60, 70 years using these sites, whether it's a city park, a state park, or whether it's a national monument like the Pullman State Historic Site. None of those who are of African-American descent are a part of that commission. And so that already to me is alarming. I mean, it's no secret that I have been a part of the landscape of state sites since 2009. Our first office was at the Pullman State Historic Site, which was as a result of the state board, which deliberately sought after and also provided access for use of space in state sites. We were the only African-American historical society and or African-American presence on any of all of 55, 56 sites. And so when Ronner got in office, all of these things kind of dismantled. And I'm not charging one person with why there isn't one state site that has an African-American interpreting Black history of Illinois. But I am angry about the fact that we're looking at this in the common lens or the more current lens of, you know, why aren't there more tributes and monuments to some of the leading greats of Illinois that are of African descent? And Dave, you know quite well that our first legislator, John W.E. Thomas, should have been on the top of the list as a priority for being recognized as one who contributed to the history of Illinois as a Black man. And yet we don't see any large presence of him in a lot of places, and not just at the state capitol. And so here we are talking about these sites that are challenged so far as their histories. But I'd like for us to start talking deliberately about why isn't there a conversation about placing those positive figures in public spheres that are managed and owned and maintained by city tax dollars, state tax dollars, or federal dollars. So, you know, even I've got Ida B. Wells behind me. I mean, it's such a great number of individuals who have contributed to positive action, whether it's in civil rights, social justice, housing, and none of these individuals I have found to have any presence in any of the state sites. So I have an issue with us, you know, just talking about these narratives as opposed to us talking about solution building to bring those individuals who should be illuminated to our public spaces. And
you bring up, again, a great point. Is it tearing down or is it expanding the discussion? And I think over last summer, it did seem, and Walt kind of referenced this, it did seem to be a lot of tearing down. Now's the time for discussion. So that leads, I mean, about what's missing. And that's where historians come in and just the general public too. What is missing? What don't we have out there? And so I'm going to turn this to Walt for a second, because again, the process to my mind really worked in Edwardsville. People upset about the statue and the park name, and they petitioned and they went to the city and the city responded. You had drafted some legislation earlier, but for their committee, could you, I guess, enlighten me, are they going to be done now? Are they going to be, let's get rid of the statue and we're finished? Or are they going to expand in a way maybe that Sherry was talking about, which is, okay, let's see what we need. Let's see what else we can do in Edwardsville to tell a bigger story and a more inclusive story.
This committee is a standing committee in Edwardsville. It's the Administrative and Community Service Committee. And they have a lot more on their plate than just evaluating monuments. So unless the residents bring this to their attention, this is where it is discussed and dealt with to move forward for city legislation or ordinances governing that right there. I don't anticipate, I don't see any other issues related to monuments coming up before this committee in the immediate future. However, let me just point out something. When the city established guidelines for monuments and statues, one of the things that we put in that ordinance was no living person will be recognized. They have to be expired for a number of years, and their background needs to be evaluated. So recently we had a donor who wanted to put their name on a park, and that ordinance prevented that person from doing that. So in turn, that donor said, family name, family park. So that was one way of getting around that ordinance. So it is something that the city never evaluated, never took, needed to look at it ourselves critically but now we are more critical of those and how we honor our citizens and moving forward. So.
Well, I don't want to age myself, but I still remember being in 5th grade in 1972 and reading about a school in California naming itself Richard Nixon Grade School. And I don't know how they feel about that now, or if the school's still there and all, but they jumped the gun a little bit with Nixon in 1972. Again, I think if the government's playing a role, which it should, I mean, it owns a lot of these sites and these are public sites, it should probably be an open process. The task force that Speaker Welch has created, again, pledges to have hearings. It seems like it's going to be open. Walt, again, I really think the system seems like it worked very well in Edwardsville. My guess is it worked in a way that left everybody upset, but isn't that the definition of something that works? And then Sherry, I certainly hope that the process there is open as well. Annie, do we have any other questions?
We have two more that have popped up.
And these will be the last two. We are getting close to our timeline, so go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think you answered part of this question, but Tim is asking, did local historical societies, such as the Madison County Historical Society, also play a hand in helping fund the Edwards statue in 2008, which I think you mentioned earlier? And then do you know what those societies' reactions have been to the statue's removal?
The city engaged the Madison County Historical Society early on in the process and asked their opinion of it. And the Madison County Historical Society gave us a very good background, very good explanation of why this statue existed. And they really didn't make a decision. They just presented the information. So you can say they were neutral. And they provided information to both sides of the argument. I do not know Madison County's involvement at first. I do know that they had some involvement, but my memory doesn't allow me to remember their involvement. So I'm going to err on a side of caution in regards to what their involvement was. I believe they were, but I just cannot articulate this at that time.
Okay. And then our last question comes from a Facebook member. She's a genealogist, and so her big question is probably for Sherry, and then Walt, if you have any of these in Edwardsville. How are monuments to fallen soldiers in POW camps such as Camp Douglas any different from the monuments to fallen soldiers in the Spanish-American War in World War I and World War II? And how does that affect future genealogists where that monument may be the only record of someone's death date and place, or even confirmation of their first name? So she's looking at the Douglas monument and the names connected to Camp Douglas and POW camps, and have them on certain monuments that may be discussed to be taken down. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my position has always been, and I actually put it in writing, that I am opposed to the removal of statues because of the expense. I really believe that if we want to talk about these places that have these troubling histories, that we could, at the beginning at least, put truthful text around these painful histories, around those monuments. I think for me, money would be better well spent in the improvements of, say, the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site, to improve its assets. The bathrooms have been broken since 2009. So where this money is coming from to remove monuments and, you know, remove markers and stuff, I'm going like, wow. But for, 20 years, the community has been asking for operating restrooms. So I'm just, my position about these sites pretty much has been, I'd rather spend my energy on erecting and putting up markers or murals or tributes to those who I know deservingly should have a marker. And it's not to deflect from the conversation, but in all of the years that we've been advocating that our assets around us that are named, regardless if it's someone that started a war, was a part of a war, was a slaveholder, was a warmonger, we wanted to just see the improvement of these assets in our communities. So for me, I think that answering the questions about the connection of Douglas to the Civil War, and it recently received a marker for Camp Douglas, I could see other things in addition that could be celebrated with a marker, and that would be the participation of the 29th Regiment of Illinois, which was the only Black regiment that was mustered in from Illinois to serve in the Civil War, and the heroic deeds that has gone unrecognized for them. So we could go side by side, talk about these assets, talk about these histories, and at the same time, you know, deeply look at how much of it has been romanticized as though these leaders were, you know, angelic. So that's one of the things I like to see happen.
You know, the question I think involves cemeteries in a large case. And Sherry, correct me if I'm wrong, but many of the dead Confederates are buried down at Oakwood Cemetery, and they do have a monument. I don't know if they've got the names for the Confederate dead, but they do have a monument. And I do remember seeing.
Oh yeah, all 6,000 plus names are on that monument.
Right. So you don't, to my mind, at a cemetery, like Sherry had said earlier, you know, you don't desecrate a cemetery, but what's, and the monument, and I think that speaks to the question at hand. But on the other hand, if you look at Oakwood Cemetery on the south side, which is a very nice cemetery, you've got this Confederate monument, but that's the burial place for Harold Washington and John W.E. Thomas and several African-American leaders through the years. And getting back to a little bit what Sherry was saying, you know, that's telling a powerful story there. With the Confederate monument, which is again a burial monument. I mean, it's a tombstone, a large tombstone, more than a monument. But what a story that tells for Chicago and for the nation. And that's the kind of those are the kind of questions. Again, as historians, you know, we're kind of looking for those kind of connections. What story are you telling? So my thoughts.
Well, that brings local history into the mix too. There are a lot of people out there that just don't know the local stories and the people who had an impact on their local communities. And a lot of them come from a variety of different backgrounds and made huge marks, but no one knows who they are because they've never been taught in the classroom. And so I guess, Sherry, I kind of side with you in trying to figure out how do we bring those people who have been left out of the regular curriculum, how do we bring them into the classroom so people have a better understanding of those who did make a huge mark that you may not see on street corners or on park names?
I think we got to start with the restoration of the Amistad Commission. So July 21, 2005, House Bill 0383 established the Amistad Commission, so that the state superintendent of education may prepare and make available to all school boards instructional materials that include the history of African slave trade and the vestiges of slavery in this country. So I know that Senator Emil Jones led that legislation in order to create this commission, which is still a commission. But it has not had its full complement since the Rauner administration. If you were to Google Illinois Amistad Commission, you will see the list ends absolutely at the year 2016, where I received my second appointment on that commission. So there were things in place that were to deliberately put education around African-American history and studies in state schools, but that commission is now by default not active because it doesn't have its full membership. So I think that's one thing that we should consider is the restoration of the Amistad Commission.
So I think, again, I think we'll wrap it up here, but Sherry brings up a great point. This is not a new issue, but this is a unique time in relation to this issue because of the involvement of the public in general. And it does, to my mind, certainly require discussion. I mean, and I think that's obviously that's great, speaking as a historian especially, but it's not a new issue. And actually, I was thinking earlier, statues at the state capitol have been controversial from the beginning to some extent. When the building opened in 1888, they wanted to put up a statue of Governor Richard Oglesby. And very controversial, especially with the committee that was in charge of the statues, because his brother-in-law was on it, and his brother-in-law hated Richard Oglesby, and that's why he didn't get a statue. All kinds of reasons, but statues have always been controversial, I think. So with that, I would encourage I want to first of all thank the panel, Sherry and Walt, and of course Andy for joining us today, and Andrea for being a part of the recording. For those of you who did not see the recording, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. I'd encourage you to look at all the recordings for the different panels that the State Historic Society has had. I think it's been a wonderful symposium overall, Zoom notwithstanding, and again, with a great group of presenters. So with that, Annie, I think and Devin, I think we wrap it up. And again, Sherry and Walt, thank you so much. All right.